Okay, so we're gonna take a look at finding the equation of a graph, right? So this is a problem that we've done on our quiz, right? So we're just gonna go over how to go about finding the equation. Right now, we're gonna be looking for an equation that is of this type right here, right? Where y is equal to a cosine b x minus c plus d, a sine bx minus c plus d. All right, now when I have a problem like this, I always want to recall just what the basic or the parent graph of the cosine and the sine look. All right, so I remember the sine doesn't really start, but I think of maybe the fundamental period starting at 0, 0, whereas the cosine, it starts at 0, 1. All right, so I'm going to start by first, let's identify in both of these questions, both of these equations, they're going to have the same value for A and the same value for D, right? The D corresponds to the vertical shift. All right, so the A is what's known as the amplitude. All right, so the A is going to be half of the distance from the highest point down to the lowest point. All right, so it'll be half the distance there, right? And notice I'm in both cases, this is negative 1.5, right? And that's how I know that D is 0. There's no shift up or down, right? So right away we could see for both my graphs, right, we're going to have here A, the amplitude of both my sine and my cosine is going to be 1.5, and then D is going to be equal to 0. There's no vertical shift. All right, so now the next thing to figure out is what is the period, and that is going to tell me how to find B. All right, so one thing I know is that B excuse me. All right, so here, if I go from one way to measure the period here, if I go from the max to the next time it achieves the max, and that is 9 pi over 8 minus pi over 8, right? The difference in the x, and that gives me pi, right? 8 pi over 8. So this is my period. All right. Okay. So the way to find B is going to be 2 pi divided by the period. Okay. So the period is pi, so B is going to be 2 pi over pi, or in this case B. Okay. All right. So now we have just about everything that we need, right? The one thing that and again, B will be the same as well for the cosine and the sine, right? The only thing that's missing here is that value for C, right? Now C is what's known as a phase shift. Right? Or in other words, a vertical shift, right? I think I was saying it wrong the previous way. There's no up or down shift. Here, a phase shift corresponds to a left or right shift. All right. So one thing, again, referring to my parent graphs, let's start with the sine, right? It starts there at the along the x-axis. So looking at my graph here, I could say, all right, one thing I can do is I could say, all right, I can think of that if that shifts over, if I start at the origin and I shift it to the left, pi over 8 units, then I get the sine graph, right? So for my sine function, the phase shift is going to be negative pi over 8. Now for my cosine, all right, and again, looking at this here, all right, if this gets shifted over to the right, pi over 8 units. So C is pi over 8. Okay. All right, and now I think we have everything to put all this together. So here, let me squeeze it in here. So we're going to have sine B was 2. Excuse me, I miswrote this over here. This should be 2. So we have sine of 2x, and in this case, plus pi over 8. D is 0, so there's nothing to put there, right? There's no up and down shift. And for the cosine 2 x minus pi over 8. And those would be both of our equations. Right now, this is not these equations are not unique. In fact, we can come up with a infinite number of equations for these. For instance, let's say that if I look at, let's say I wanted to start my sine, right? Let's say I say, all right, well, what if it's here? That's my phase shift, right? Now, the only thing here is you notice that instead of starting rising, it starts going down, right? Or decreasing, right? The one thing that'll change is, so here, let me work off to the side here. Let's say that I wanted to have this to be my phase shift. Okay, so the A is not going to change. The amplitude remains the same. The period doesn't change either. Now this here is not quite right, the way that it's kind of stated right now. Right? The reason being is that the sign starts up, so in order to change that, starting down is just put a negative in front of it, in front of the A. All right, and that'll give you this effect that when we do graph this, right, if I interpret the phase shift to be 3 pi over 8, the negative starts it down here instead of rising, right? Now you could have also done this. Now in this case, this does start rising, right? So you would just change, the 1.5 would be positive, but now the C would be 7 pi over 8, right? So as you can see, there are very different ways to represent this equation in terms of sine or cosine. All right. Okay. Thank you.